Muito boa tarde a todos. É um gosto ver-vos tantos e aqui, depois de tanto tempo em que não podemos ter tantas pessoas numa sala. A nossa série Lisbon Lectures in the Humanities também sofreu destes intervalos, mas agora com um grande ânimo e entusiasmo e, de certo, não inconsciência, vamos poder retomá-la. A ideia é termos na Universidade de Lisboa, 2 vezes por ano, grandes nomes das humanidades aqui na Faculdade de Letras. Um na primavera, outro no outono. E agora as pessoas já recomeçaram a confirmar e, portanto, já temos oradores previstos para o próximo outono e para a próxima primavera. Hoje vamos ter connosco o maestro Alfred Brendel e o meu colega João Figueiredo vai apresentá-lo. E, portanto, aquilo que me cumpre é simplesmente agradecer a uma série de pessoas e instituições sem as quais esta operação tão complicada não teria sido possível. Em primeiro lugar, à FLUL, a Associação de Desenvolvimento da Faculdade de Letras, e ao seu presidente, o meu colega Arnaldo Espírito Santo. Em segundo lugar, à DSCH, a Associação Musical DSCH, e ao pianista Filipe Pinto Ribeiro, que nos ajudou tanto e que colaborou tanto nesta operação logística tão interessante. Em terceiro lugar, à Divisão de Relações Externas e Internacionais da Faculdade de Letras, que montou a logística local desta operação. Resta-me, finalmente, fazer 2 agradecimentos pessoais à minha colega Cláudia Fischer, que eu não estou a ver, mas tenho a certeza que está aqui, e que se empenhou fortemente, ela e os seus alunos, nesta operação. E, finalmente, ao meu colega João Dionísio, without whom isto não teria sido sempre possível. E agora espero que passem uma boa hora e vou dar a palavra ao meu colega João Figueiredo. Muito obrigado.
Good evening. Introducing Alfred Brendel risks being an exercise in redundancy, but it is also an expression of immense gratitude for the many hours of pure bliss, both in the concert hall and at home while listening to his records. This is also an act of appreciation for his prolific thinking and writing about music and how it should be played. Excepting perhaps poets and novelists, it is not common for an artist to share his thoughts about his art with the public, let alone with such brilliance and insight. And therefore, no amount of appreciation for Dr. Brendel's art, or arts, would be enough. Since it would take me many hours to express my personal gratitude, and that, rest assured, I will not try to do here, I shall do my best to mitigate redundancy. Therefore, let me say a few words on some of the major concerns that have occupied our distinguished guest as an essayist. And because his latest book, published in 2019, is perhaps not yet as well known as the previous titles, and since it revisits in a new light many of those topics, I shall concentrate on it. Only the last section of The Lady from Arezzo, My Musical Life and Other Matters, is clearly autobiographical. But it would be difficult not to say the whole book can be read as a self-portrait, as it addresses many of the intellectual interests Alfred Brendel is known for. Mixing deep insights on music and life with nonsensical and humorous poems by several authors of his predilection, this book is set under the aegis of Dada. It is easy to understand why. As the author says, Dada was not a fashion, a style, or a doctrine. we can better understand it as a condition, a spirit, a productive state of mind that has remained alive." End quote. Still, according to Brendel, Dada's main elements are paradox, chance, abandon, protest, aggression, anti-nationalism, humor, irony, bluff, art, and mysticism. And he concludes by saying that he lists himself, quote, "among those to whom the dance amid contradictions constitutes the essence of life." Although he stresses that, in his case, Dada is more a philosophy of life than an aesthetic, and so no one should look for it in his piano playing, Dr. Brendel's attitude towards his career as a musician is clearly indebted to this condition or spirit, as he calls it. He is proud to say that throughout his life he has remained a free person. And, as it is stated at the end of the volume, quote, "only in contradiction does the world seem to become a little less absurd," which is in line with the assertion that in his teaching there is no dogma, as dogma soon reveals to be a waste of time. In that line of thought, he subtly warns stage directors against pretending to offer commentaries and parody of operas on stage, and against the strictures of historical informed performance. Such conviction is most welcome in a school of humanities, as I believe many of us would agree, and it is with particular joy that I read those words from such a master of interpretation. Against dogma, he suggests listening to orchestras, conductors, ensembles, and singers for the sake of cantabile, character, and rhythm. In a word, he warns against excessive specialization in music, something that defines mostly one type of pianists, those who play Chopin. Indeed, most of us in this amphitheater, philosophers, philologists, historians, art historians, and literary critics, can easily relate to what is probably the main concern throughout his essays on music. That is, the manifold, endless questions concerning the interpretation of music. All of us who deal with texts and artifacts of different sorts can immediately recognize all inquiry into the nature of musical interpretation as akin to what we do here as part of the humanities. In his writings, Dr. Brendel repeatedly tackles the vexata question of how a score is meant to be interpreted in order to materialize the Platonic idea in the composer's mind into a sensorial experience. How the markings the composer added to the score are to be read so the music sounds coherent and cantabile. What is the leeway the pianist allows himself, or the composer allows him, to exercise his or her freedom for the score to become alive? One example of this occurs when Dr. Brendel disputes a singer's views on Schubert, apropos one specific song from Winterreise. The issue might sound too technical for the non-initiated. Quote, "Should in Schubert the semiquaver following a dotted quaver be played simultaneously with the third triplet note as a dotted triplet? In any case, technical intricacies aside, the general problem is familiar to us. Here, Brendel relies on philology to argue for assimilation, but stresses that, even more decisively, it is the interpreter's sensitivity and familiarity with Schubert's style that settles the matter. The simpler rhythmic solution is the best, as it conforms to the naturality of Schubert's writing in many other instances." His essays on light and darkness in music addresses another question a student of humanities is conversant with, should I say, is condemned to be conversant with. That is, the difficulty of translating non-verbal artifacts like music into verbal discourse, and a constant need to seek assistance from metaphor. Conversely, music seldom resists the appeal to depict reality by means of sound. Richard Strauss bragged about being able to tell the audience whether the dinner service in an opera was made of china or silver through the sheer mastery of orchestration. But Dr. Brendel reminds us that Haydn, in his The Creation, Schöpfung, was very selective and wisely decided to leave the line, "and God created the big whales," out of the picture. Haydn is precisely one of Dr. Brendel's heroes, and his music one of the recurrent subjects of his writings. In his tireless apology of Haydn, he also reminds us that Haydn was the initiator of musical humor. As Goethe put it in a passage that offers the title for today's lecture, temperament, sense, intelligence, humor, sweetness, power, and ultimately naivety and irony, those are the true hallmarks of genius. These are also the hallmarks of Alfred Brendel. A skilled poet, he translated Christian Morgenstern's The Knee, including in The Lady from Arezzo. As a foretaste to the book, allow me to read it. A knee walks lonely through the world. It's nothing but a knee. It's not a tent. It's not a tree. It's nothing but a knee. There was a man who in the war was maimed from head to feet. The knee alone remained unscathed. A miracle indeed. Since then it's walking through the world. It's nothing but a knee. It's not a tent. It's not a tree. It's nothing but a knee. This poor joint, so hopelessly out of joint when all the rest of the body is gone, deprived from the erotic allure it might have had once, reminds us of Plato's saying that the world should be carved at its joints in order to be known and understood. Articulation, incidentally, is what the pianist must never eschew for the sake of pure legato, a warning insistently made by Dr. Brendel in his books and lectures. In life, as in music, sharp humor and articulation turn out to be the finest instruments to carve the world and to make sense of life and music. I promised I would be brief in keeping with Dr. Brendel's writing style. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a warm welcome to our distinguished guest.
In an article written after a performance of Haydn's great oratorio, The Creation, in Weimar in 1826, we read the statement that Haydn's music revealed the true signs of genius, naivety and irony. The piece seems to have been written by Goethe's friend Karl Friedrich Zelter, with Goethe looking over his shoulder, for publication in Goethe's magazine Kunst und Altertum. Later in this lecture, I shall return to this statement. Let me first give you two quotations from the Goethe literature, the German Goethe literature. Here is the first. This greatest among the greats entertained only highly Platonic relations to music. Where he connected to it, he did so in the wrong place. At the same time, one couldn't say that his life was thoroughly devoid of music. It is just that such relations were caused by the pressures and of social convention, rather than by an inner urge. And here's the second. Music was rather more removed from his senses. He enjoyed in it the pleasant noise that entertained him when he could experience it firsthand, as during the visits of young Mendelssohn. But he did not savor it as an essence of life. To him, the music of his own poetry sufficed, and rightly so. With acoustical experiments, he didn't waste any time at all. These two statements from the early 20th century are wrong on almost all counts. Let us first investigate what Goethe said himself. Here are some of his views on music. Whoever doesn't love music does not deserve to be called a human being. Loving music makes you half human, while pursuing music as a profession produces the human being complete. The dignity of art, says Goethe, may manifest itself most eminently in music, because there is no extraneous matter. Music is form and content entirely, and ennobles all it expresses. Were language not to be the undoubted pinnacle, I should place music even higher and as the absolute summit. To Zelter he wrote, when listening to Bach, it seems to me as if the eternal harmony is conducting a conversation with itself. I felt that I neither possessed nor needed ears, let alone eyes, nor any other senses. In his maxims and reflections, Goethe writes, music is holy and profane. The holy is in proportion with its dignity, and it is here that music has the strongest effect on life, remaining unchanged throughout all times and epochs. The profane, on the other hand, should keep itself thoroughly cheerful. Goethe's advice was, do not read, always sing. According to Goethe, music is the place from where all true poems originate and whence they return. In his novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, we read, how simple singing affects me. No word about the ancient magical force of music seems to me misplaced. And here are two lines from one of his late poems. First in German. Das Auge netzt sich, fühlt im höheren Sehnen den Götterwert der Töne und der Tränen. The eye moistens and feels in higher longing the divine value of sounds and tears. This is from a poem dedicated to the pianist Maria Szymanowska. In talking about the demonic, Goethe pronounced, according to Eckermann, music ranks so high that no intellect can approach it, and it radiates an effect that holds sway over everything, an effect no one is able to give an account of. The demonic does not lend itself to be solved by intellect or reason. It is not part of my nature, Goethe says, but I am subjected to it. He also asks, don't you feel that in my poems I am one and double? and concludes, Drum danket alle Gott, ihr Söhne der Zeit, dass die Pole für ewig entzweit. Therefore, let us all be grateful to God for separating the poles forever. In connection with Goethe's irony, I shall examine his contradictions later. In spite of his encyclopedic interests, his massive output as a writer, his supervision of Vienna University, his duties for the government, his deep involvement in the natural sciences, and his wide reading in Latin and Greek, English, French, and Italian, Goethe hardly ever lost touch with music. His advice, do not read, always sing, can be taken very nearly at face value. A poem he wrote in English when he was not yet 17 contained the lines, I hum no supportable tune, I can no poet be. Much of Goethe's poetry was written with the idea of music in the back of his mind. Poems had to be set to music as promptly as possible, or were invented to fit melodies that already existed. Several of Goethe's or Schiller's poems were published for the first time with the music already attached to them. In the first edition of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre, the wonderful poems that mysteriously appear in this novel were all furnished with musical settings by Johann Friedrich Reichard. Goethe subsumed many of his poems under the title Lieder. This was fairly common at the time. And always started the editions of his collected works with them. To please Goethe, the settings had to be musically simple and remain subservient to the text, while strophic poems had, as in folk songs, to persist doggedly with the initial tune, no matter whether there were 3 strophes or 10. Today this makes for tedious listening, and even in Goethe's time would have had the sole advantage of committing the tune to memory. Variety of the delivery had to be supplied by the performer. Not the composer had to characterize, but the singer. The first as well as the second Berliner Liederschule established the norm, and Goethe's most prolific composer friends, Reichard and Zelter, were its outstanding exponents. The essential simplicity of the settings was a reaction both to the complexity of the Baroque and to the virtuoso coloratura of Italian arias. The aim was to concentrate on an art that, with the help of only a few notes, would unpretentiously touch the heart. Goethe loved to tell his composer friends what to do and what to avoid when they set his poems, but also when they tried to provide music for his light opera libretti. The pursuit of opera comique, opera buffa, and Singspiel was to exercise Goethe for most of his life. In fact, Goethe loathed opera seria and vastly preferred music such as Cimarosa's, that is light and cheerful. According to the singer Eduard Genas, Goethe had no equal when it came to declaiming comic texts in his bass voice, whereas in tragedy, false pathos occasionally crept in. His friend, Philipp Christoph Kaiser, noted that in Goethe's libretti, the opera was quasi pre-composed. The instructions were so detailed that the composer was left with very little leeway. Goethe's and Kaiser's aim had been to confine themselves to the simple and the restricted. Several of Goethe's Buffa or Singspiel libretti were duly composed and staged, and he even included some of them in his collected works. Among his composers were Johann André, Karl Sigmund von Seckendorf, the singer and actress Corona Schröter, the Duchess Anna Amalia, as well as Kaiser and Reichard. 13 different musical settings of Claudine von Villabella and 16 of Jeri und Veteri are extant. As recently as the 20th century, Ottmar Schöck composed Erwin and Elmira, and Egon Welles, one of Schönberg's pupils, Scherz, List und Rache. Hugo von Hofmannsthal studied Goethe's libretti and wrote a preface to a published collection of them. None of this music, however, has made a lasting impact, and the triumph of Mozart's Seraglio dwarfed all other attempts to create a German Singspiel. Goethe was obsessed by song and singing. In a lead composition, he thought the music ought to be derived directly from the words and the verbal melody and remain undisturbed by attempts to illustrate or interpret the poem. The music had to serve the poem and not illuminate it. He believed, with his great friend Johann Gottfried Herder, that it is in music that all truly poetic works originate and to which they return. When the young Goethe collected Alsatian folk songs and ballads at Herder's request, it was to Goethe's sister Cornelia that he sang them before she wrote them down. Arnims und Brentanos' celebrated collection of folk poetry, Das Knaben Wunderhorn, appeared from 1806 on with a dedication to Goethe, who praised it highly. In the Oriental poetry that gave so much pleasure to Goethe, singing next to loving, drinking, and praying was a major occupation. Marianne von Willemer, the extraordinary young woman who contributed some of the loveliest poems to Goethe's West-Eastern Diva, delighted him by singing her own songs while accompanying herself on the guitar. Music is central to Goethe's final novel, Wilhelm Meister's Wanderjahre. For the inhabitants of the pedagogical province, singing is the first step of education. Everything else follows from it and is made accessible by it. Whenever in Wanderjahre people meet, there is communal singing. Goethe himself seems to have always needed someone to sing for him. In Weimar, there were 3 young women known by name who alternately visited his house to perform Lieder. In later years, when Goethe rarely left the house, he assembled his own domestic Collegium Musicum Vocale. The singers were afforded the privilege of rehearsing in the quarters belonging to his partner Christine and were rewarded with a simple meal. Goethe sometimes intervened in rehearsals, offering his views about tempo and expression. Goethe's musical needs seem to have been constant, but they were limited. It appears that he never listened to a performance of a symphony of Haydn, Mozart, or Beethoven. The fact that Mendelssohn introduced him to Beethoven's Fifth on the piano hardly counts as a proper performance. While one of his ears was wide open to singing, the other resisted instrumental music, unless it was performed by young prodigies or impressive ladies. Goethe had witnessed the 7-year-old Mozart perform in Frankfurt. It made a huge impression that was to stay with him for the rest of his life. Other child prodigies who played for him were Mendelssohn, whom he loved like a son, Clara Wieck, Karl Eckert, and Ferdinand Hiller. In Goethe's words, original talent is grist to my mill. As for the ladies, he fell for the Polish pianist Maria Szymanowska towards the end of his life. A male exception was the pianist and organist Johann Heinrich Friedrich Schütz, Goethe's private musician, whose playing of Bach and more recent piano music he was able to listen to for 3 or 4 hours a day. Goethe obtained a copy of Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier for him. Nothing, however, could surpass the delight of listening to the leading divas of the operatic stage, Gertrud Schmeling, Corona Schröter, Anna Milda Hauptmann, Wilhelmine Schröder-Devrien, or Henriette Sonntag. When Goethe settled in Weimar, the city was a musical backwater. Johann Sebastian Bach had admittedly spent some years there as violinist in the Duke's household in 1703, and then from 1708 as his organist and musical supervisor. About 50 years later, Weimar's court music consisted of a music director, a court organist, 10 court oboists, 1 court pandura player, 8 musical trumpeters, and 2 timpanists. In 1775, the 18-year-old Karl August took over the government. According to Christoph Martin Wieland, Goethe enjoyed the unconditional trust and particular affection of the Duke. In 1791, Goethe was appointed to be in charge of Weimar's theater, a position from which he resigned 26 years later. During this period, the theater mounted more than 1,800 events, including 600 stage works, among which there were 104 operas and 31 Singspiele. Remarkably, all of Mozart's later operas were presented, most frequently The Magic Flute and Don Giovanni. When Goethe himself staged The Magic Flute, he is said to have rearranged the sequence of some of the scenes, and the words were rewritten. So taken was Goethe with this opera that he penned the libretto for a sequel which has wisely not been composed. Schiller pointed out to him in a letter that no text would be able to save an opera if the music was not convincing. During the 10 years of Goethe's connection with Reichard, it was he who counseled Goethe in the choice of words and singers. The final period of Goethe's theatrical reign was made unpalatable by the lady friend of the Duke, the singer and actress Caroline Jagemann, who wielded her influence as a kind of co-director. Goethe, who was not a fighter, progressively withdrew. With our brand of opera, he said, I have little desire to be involved. The quality of performances must have been that of a provincial theatre, the orchestra modest, few of the singers outstanding, and rehearsal time scarce. There was no permanent choir, and the students of the school had to be borrowed for performances to the displeasure of their teachers. In drama, the situation was somewhat different. Both its repertoire and the quality of acting were elevated by Goethe, who turned Weimar into one of the liveliest stages in Germany. The operatic repertoire of the time featured composers who have since vanished: Méhul, Aubert, Boieldieu, Paer, Marschner, Spontini. Only from 1791 did Weimar entertain a permanent court theatre. Before that, apart from a few visiting companies, Weimar's musical theatre life relied mainly on amateurs, including several members of the aristocracy, who acted, sang, composed, and wrote for it. Goethe himself masterminded everything and played some of the leading roles as long as they did not require singing. He particularly enjoyed facing on stage the beautiful Corona Schröter. She was the only professional singer, and she also composed and painted. Goethe, who was a skilled draftsman, sometimes accompanied her on her drawing expeditions. One of Goethe's finest drawings shows Corona asleep. Of the major composers, Goethe was taken by Palestrina, whose music he had encountered during his sudden and unannounced trip to Italy in 1786. He valued Handel's oratorios and even contemplated to surpass Messiah with a 10-part work to include all the essential events in the Bible. It belongs to the many contradictions in Goethe that he was particularly attracted to sacred music, while confessing to being neither a Christian nor a believer. In his earlier years, he much admired Gluck, but was taken aback when Gluck declined to compose the poems he had sent him, telling him that an opera composer does not need streamlined verse. Goethe admired Jean-Jacques Rousseau, at the time well known for his opera comique Le Devin de Village, for the simplicity and straightforwardness of his musical style. He had praise for Haydn's masses, and above all for Mozart, the incomparable, who composed Das Veilchen, mistaking it for a poem by Gleim. Here it is, sung by the young Irmgard Seefeld. Mozart's setting, by the way, is less a song than a little dramatic scene. Beethoven was his death spot. The one exception was Beethoven's incidental music for Goethe's Egmont, which he greatly appreciated. Zelda himself said about Beethoven that he admired him with horror, and that some of his works appeared to him like children whose father was a woman and whose mother a man. There is no reason to doubt that Goethe shared Zelda's views. Between Karl Maria von Weber and Goethe, the aversion was mutual. When the young Berlioz sent him his scenes for Faust, Opus 1, Zelda, who was fond of colorful language, called it an abscess generated by incestuous filth. Schubert and Karl Löwe, the great innovative masters of Lied and ballad, Goethe did not acknowledge. Neither was Beethoven rewarded for the 20 Goethe songs he composed. It needed the inspiring presence of Wilhelmine Schröder-Devrien to convince him late in his life that Schubert's Erlkönig made sense. In such a performance, he said, it amounts to a visible picture. Goethe was a strongly visual person. Beethoven and Schubert, on the other hand, revered Goethe's writings. When both Goethe and Beethoven visited the Bohemian spas, they met in 1812 4 times in Teplitz, as well as subsequently in Karlsbad. After the first meeting, Goethe wrote to Christiane, zusammengefasster, energischer, inniger habe ich noch keinen Künstler gesehen. I've never encountered an artist more concentrated, more energetic, or more cordial. These words are to Goethe's everlasting credit, as they are wonderfully relevant even to Beethoven's music, to its density, its propelling construction, and its warmth and tenderness. Beethoven always remembered Goethe with the deepest gratitude, although he seemed to have been piqued by his evident sympathy for the ailing Empress Maria Ludovica of Austria, with whom he spent many hours in Teplitz. Goethe, on the other hand, found Beethoven too untamed. He agreed with him in finding the world detestable, but didn't see the point of sharing this with everyone. In Weimar, there had been no elevated concert life until Johann Nepomuk Hummel took on responsibility for the music. Hummel was considered the leading pianist of his time and was highly respected as a composer. He raised the standards of Weimar's opera and performed symphonies after decades during which traveling virtuosi had presented themselves at the court. It was not until the later 18th century that vocal music gradually ceased to dominate and instrumental music came to the fore. Neither of the musicians with whom Goethe had the closest contact was a symphonist or a touring virtuoso. Both Kaiser and Reichert were capable pianists and singers. Kaiser, whom Goethe had known since his time as a law student, was considered a genius by his friends, and Goethe tried to help him, not least financially. Goethe's Swiss friend Johann Caspar Lavater reproduced Kaiser's face 3 times in his physiognomical fragments as the paragon of musicians, while Goethe was the book's central star. But Kaiser preferred to lead a modest life in Zurich and disappointed Goethe's expectations. Reichard, on the other hand, was hyperactive as a composer, gifted writer, and personal presence. In Berlin's musical life, he had occupied a central position since his 23rd year. He is thought to have composed more than 1,000 songs, among them all Goethe's poems that he could lay his hands on, and also larger works that sometimes almost crushed Goethe with his activity. While Goethe had thrust his libretti on Kaiser, Reichard forced his music on Goethe without waiting for his instructions. His musical version of Vieri und Beetele continued to be successful for years. When Reichard declared his support for the French Revolution, however, he lost Goethe's sympathy. Schiller loathed him anyway. Carl Friedrich Zelter then became not only Goethe's favorite composer, but turned into one of his closest friends over a period of more than 30 years. Zelter, too, in his own way, was a highly gifted communicator. And the exchange of 871 letters of unruffled liveliness and sympathy was to become a fine conclusion to Goethe's own autobiographical writing. Zelter was a bricklayer by profession. He had taken over his father's flourishing welding firm in Berlin. Gradually, he freed himself from this obligation and became a full-time musician. During Napoleon's reign in Berlin, there were, as he explained, no bricks to lay, which enabled him to take over the Singakademie in 1800 and turn it into one of the leading choirs of the time. His brilliant young pupil Mendelssohn used it for his much admired revival of Bach's St. Matthew Passion. Zelter also established the first Liedertafel, a confraternity of friends who sang but also wrote poetry as well as composing. For more than a century, Liedertafeln, male voice choirs, were to be a mainstay of musical life. Zelter loved and worshipped Goethe and was capable of turning out 6 different versions of Goethe's mignon poem, Kennst du das Land? More than 70 lieder were produced in close collaboration. As Goethe declined to travel to Berlin, Zelter visited him in Weimar 14 times and stayed with him for 20 days after the departure of Maria Szymanowska left Goethe seriously ill. Unlike Reichard, Zelter never managed a larger work, and the bizarre text of Goethe's cantata Die erste Walpurgisnacht was left uncomposed until young Mendelssohn proved to be up to its demands. Unfortunately, Goethe did not live to hear the results. About the poet Goethe, Jeremy Adler wrote, "The wish as an author to dominate the musical form limits the composer to a subservient position. It is a historical irony that a poet so conservative in his views should have inspired the new genre of lied. The impact that Goethe's writings had on music left the limited compass of his own musical aesthetics far behind, and it contradicted his notions of what music should be like and where music should go. With the advent of Schubert, Lieder were elevated from the status of an everyday commodity to masterpieces in their own right, and to one of the peak achievements of 19th century music. It was Goethe's limitation that he could not imagine the musical potential slumbering in his own poems, because he was too absorbed by the form and music of his own words. The greatest poet of the German language produced poetry, the sound and rhythm of which remained to him dominant and nearly self-sufficient. The small liberties and variants in some of Reichardt's or Zelter's compositions are on a very different scale from the new musical grasp that the 17-year-old Schubert revealed. Immediately with Gretchen am Spinnrade, the first example of a new style emerged, perfectly formed. While Schumann, as an instrumental composer, needed to reach the year 1822 to come fully into his own, his lead production as a teenager was already yielding songs of an overwhelming completeness. Schubert was lucky enough to find a singing partner of great persuasion in Johann Michael Vogel. Performing Lieder well became an art. Lieder were freed from the gossip of unpretentious simplicity. Character, atmosphere, and psychology received their due with the help of piano writing that supplemented, interpreted, and commented on the poetry in a way that was anathema to Goethe. The new piano style, in its sensitivity to nuance and its inclusions of orchestral color, paves the way for Liszt, who admittedly over-egged it in his transcriptions of Schubert's. In spite of being no virtuoso player himself, Schubert must have been capable of tackling the piano part of his songs most convincingly. Immediately, in the very first bars of the song, Schubert is able to present its characteristics in a nutshell. In Der Lindenbaum, we have the rustling of the leaves, the breeze, and the murmur of the well. In Dorfer combines the rattling of the chain, the barking of the dogs, and the snoring of the sleepers. Beginning of Eric with his bold repeated octaves conjures the night, the wind, and the galloping of the horse. And Gretchen am Spinnrade opens with the spinning wheel, the foot that keeps it in motion, and the restlessness of the heart. Lotte Lehmann conveys this with unmatched intensity.
Ich nicht
You hear in this singing the art of portamento, which has unfortunately been lost or neglected by most singers. Goethe's poems became the most frequently composed. Not only did the German romantics up to Hugo Wolf and Richard Strauss set them to music, but also composers in a variety of countries and cultures, including the American Charles Ives. The one place I failed to find any Goethe lieder, besides Benjamin Britt's remarkable setting of Mitternacht, was Britain. The English language didn't have the good fortune of providing mediators of the caliber of Schlegel and Tieck, thanks to whom Shakespeare became part of German literary culture during the 19th century. Probably very few people would care about Goethe's poetry on British shores if it weren't for Schubert's songs. It was not until Goethe's poetry, it was not only Goethe's poetry that inspired composers of various nationalities. The hugely successful early novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, generated an opera by Rodolphe Kreutzer as early as 1792, followed by Jules Massenet's Werther, and 100 years later. Among the countless renderings of Faust, there were the remarkable works by Berlioz and Schumann, and of course, Gounod's international hit. There was Ferruccio Busoni's fascinating Dr. Faust, unfinished but completed by Philipp Janach as well as Anthony Baumann, and based on the puppet play of Dr. Faust that predated Goethe's own versions. Here is Busoni's Hexenlied, Witches' Song, sung by Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau with the pianist Karl Engel. There were also Richard Wagner's early Gesänge zu Faust and his later Faust Overture. And there was Liszt's masterpiece and a Faust Symphony from 1860, but also its companion piece, the great B minor piano sonata, that can, I think, be safely located in Faust's orbit, although the work lacks poetic title. According to Goethe himself, it was Mozart alone who would have been capable of doing justice to the subject. Since the late 19th century, however, Faust has come to life in another form. Georges Méliès, the extraordinary pioneer of moving pictures, made no fewer than 4 short films on Faust. And among the later filmmakers turning their attention to Faust, we find Murnau, Gründgens, and Gorsky. Reading the second part of Faust today, it may strike us as an amalgam of drama, opera, movie, cabaret, alchemy, and hallucination. It would have been very ordinary indeed if Goethe, who searched for the Urpflanze, the primeval plant, as well as for the origin of the colors, had not attempted to deal with the origin of music. With the physicist Ernst Chladni, Goethe discussed acoustical concepts as well as musical ones. Through Chladni, he started to grasp how it had been possible to make use of the complete set of musical keys in major and minor. With Zelter, he discussed the significance of major and minor, dismissing Rameau's explanation of the major as the natural and domineering mode, thanks to its foundation in the rising row of overtones, while the undertones that produce the minor mode leave merely a shadowy existence. Goethe insisted on the emotional importance of both and assumed that they were manifestations of the rule of polarity. In his theory of colors, he discusses the phenomenon that suggests either an initial split that is capable of merging, or a unity that is capable of splitting. To him, this eternal systole and diastole represented the essence of nature. Rameau's view, by the way, is still manifest in the fact that we talk about major and minor even today. Meanwhile, since the beginning of the 20th century, music that is rooted in the harmony produced by overtones has been largely abandoned. In the last decade of his life, Goethe sketched an extensive outline of the theory of sound that aims to develop the rules of the audible. He called it tone learning, and had it copied out on a large piece of paper, keeping it on one of the walls of his bedroom until the end of his life. I would now like to return to my initial quote about Haydn, written by Goethe and Zelter. It grants Haydn the true ingredients of genius, naivety and irony. These two qualities seem to be opposites, like trust and skepticism, immediacy and distance, simplicity and complexity. In 18th century literature, we find, according to the great ironologist Müller, the complex ironizing the simple, the ambiguous, the clear-cut, the uncertain, the certain, and the relative, the absolute. For Friedrich Schlegel, the ingenious young German romanticist, the world was paradoxical, and only an ambivalent attitude could grasp its contradiction. It was partly thanks to Schlegel, who had used the word 1789 in connection with a much-noticed review of Goethe's Wilhelm Meister, that the concept of irony became one of the most fashionable of the early 19th century. Mühlke asks whether it is prudent to attempt any formal definitions at all. Erich Eller, in his book The Ironic Journey, has already quite adequately not defined irony. As Mühlke said, there would be little point in not defining it all over again. Irony may not be merely the natural or merely the best way, but, according to Mühlke, perhaps the only way to get on with life. The point is not to be either naive or ironic, but both. According to Schlegel, Goethe's naivety was his supreme irony. The beautifully, poetical, and ideally naive needs, as he said, to be simultaneously intentional and instinctive. And here we have arrived at what seems to me one of Goethe's most significant traits. He writes to Count Sternberg in 1826 that one shouldn't take the positive and factual too seriously, but rather rise above them with the help of irony in order to preserve their problematic quality. But he also writes to Duke Karl August that irony, from its most delicate peak to its dullest base, presents 100 ways of tormenting people without giving them the chance to complain. Remarks such as these confirm that the Olympian equilibrium of Goethe's personality, whenever it was achieved, was a balancing act. To Goethe, love poetry and sarcasm were equally available. The propensity for the fantastical distinguished him no less than his need for order, which could border on the pedantic, as in the pedagogical province of Wanderjahr. To quote the Swiss scholar Adolf Musch, Goethe's mastery was the product not of a safe, but of a hazardous existence. In Haydn's music, all winds are held in check by clarity, and his emotions are never threatened. Should have given Goethe great satisfaction to observe naivety and irony, these old foes, to be dancing together in such unalloyed harmony. Thank you very much.